One of my favorite things, having been at St. Benedict's, is all of the young families. But that has the other side of that coin, is it makes me realize how much older I'm getting. And today, more importantly, because I forgot to put on my dalmatic before I walked out for Mass, so that's why I'm not fully dressed. So a senior moment, I think they call that. In 2 weeks, we will be celebrating Easter. And this is the highlight of the church. It should be the highlight of all the Christian churches, but it seems like somehow Christmas, which is important, kind of offsets sometimes the miracle that is Easter. Sorry, it's not St. Patrick's Day. It's not the most important day of the church year. In fact, without Easter, there would be no Christianity. St. Paul in Corinthians tells us that if Christ had not been raised, then our faith is empty. This is why for the past 4 weeks, we as the Christian community have been preparing in a special way for this great event. When we scrutinize the awesomeness of this event, it makes us want to be more like Christ and to live lives more in harmony with His. We're called to want to carry out the great commandment of loving God and loving neighbor. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the 10 Commandments. These were given to the Israelites by God as a pattern for life. For them, for Jesus who followed them, and for us who follow Jesus. So if we are to pattern our lives after that of Jesus, then we must first consider what Hebrews tells us of Jesus, and that is, He learned obedience. And the first obedience we must learn is that of the 10 Commandments. Anytime we want to develop a new habit, whether in our business life, our personal life, or our spiritual life, we need a set of rules. And in our lives as followers of Christ, we must know the rules. So we start with the 10 Commandments, and from there, Jeremiah, in our first reading, tells us that God will place His law within them and write it upon their hearts. It is only after we deliberately study and practice the written law that God can then place that law on our hearts. What does that mean? It means that His law becomes as natural to us as the beating of our heart. It means that His law is there for us to act out naturally. You know, we probably rarely think about our hearts beating. Make it simpler. How many of you with any cooking experience has to get out a recipe book to fry an egg? But there was a time when somebody had to either tell you, show you, instruct you, and now you just do it without thinking. You know exactly how hard to crack the egg. It just becomes second nature to you. In the ancient times, before the working of the human body was fully understood, it was thought that the brain controlled all of the involuntary actions, but that the heart controlled the cognitive and voluntary actions. So that to have God's law placed on your heart was to place God's law at the source of all your thinking and action. Now let's go back to where in Hebrews from today. It was a very short reading, but it's packed with a dynamic concept to grasp. Why? Because the very idea of obedience, suffering, and perfection, frankly, troubles the modern mind. It seems like we spend an awful lot of time trying to avoid pain and suffering and, to a large degree, obedience. You know, one of my least favorite cliches of this generation is, well, that's my truth. Okay? That's that rebellion against obedience. Society tells us that the only obedience we are called to is the obedience to do our own thing. A being true to oneself approach. And suffering must be avoided at all costs in a society whose categorized imperative holds that life is simply to enjoy, and perfection is not possible in a culture if there is suffering. These words that are contained in Hebrews invite us to rethink our notions about obedience, suffering, perfection, and relationship to God. I just finished reading a book that Father Mike Schmitz is talking about during Lent called He Leadeth Me, about a Catholic priest who spent more than 20 years in the Russian prisons, Siberian prisons, and work camps. And this was his message, was about obedience and the acceptance of suffering and the reliance on God. So obedience is not a mindless following of rules and regulations. It's not a denial of our freedom or intellect, but a mature obedience is the ability to listen and to respond. Mature obedience is found in the person who is truly liberated from the childish cravings of the ego and passions. To hear and respond to God's call in our daily lives mean that we possess the ability to forget ourselves and to serve others. Only love makes such a task possible. And suffering, although it's never sought to be a good in itself, to do so would be kind of unnatural. However, we do need to recognize that life is not trouble-free, and it's not without its crosses. Suffering comes to all of us at some point. So it's not a question, are we going to have to suffer, but how do we respond to the suffering that comes our way? Respond. If you're sick, you go to the doctor gives you some medicine, he says, come back tomorrow, and the doctor says, oh, you responded well to that medicine. That means we're getting better. What if the doctor said, oh, you reacted to that medicine? That's a bad thing. Same thing. Do we react to suffering? By moaning and groaning and telling everybody that will listen, and even those that don't listen, how bad it is? Or do we respond? Remember, Christ tells us, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. It is only in suffering a death to self that we will really experience what it means to be a fully human being. It is only this dying to self and removing from our lives that which is harmful and not with God that we make room in our hearts for God's law. And perfectionism produces performance anxiety or refusal to perform at all. Yet, to be perfected through obedience and a suffering love is not accomplished in a single day. The whole of one's life and beyond is about being perfected into the love of the Father every day, going back, going back, going back. It will not happen in a day. The work of being perfected is not a compulsive set of objectives that we must attain by ourselves. Rather, to be perfected is to daily allow God's loving grace to change our hearts of stone into hearts of flesh, and therefore His love can be put upon our hearts. And finally, in our moments of real suffering, it is important to remember that God's own Son was not spared. The new covenant, which Jeremiah talks about, was written on our hearts. It does not excuse us from life or service or the cross. The Christian will have his or her own cross to carry. However, it is the carrying of this cross with an obedient, suffering love that we come to be perfected in God's unbounded love. Is any of this easy? Absolutely not. But most things that are worthwhile aren't easy. However, there isn't a better time to start than now. Now, as we approach this most blessed feast and season of Easter, the day when the new covenant of Christ came into full being. So, if your Lent thus far has been a little unsettling or unfulfilling, this may be the time to tell God that you are ready to obey Him, suffer for Him, and attempt to live a perfect life for His glory.